Currency collapse, power, and legal design. 1. Research question and thesis. You examine whether major currency failures arise from random shock or from deliberate choices by actors who control law, policy, and balance sheets. You test the claim that collapses often function as instruments that cancel unpayable obligations, reprice assets, and consolidate influence. You approach the question as a lawyer who reads statutes, treaties, and institutional charters alongside monetary data and historical episodes. Footnote. You are told that the working thesis is intentional design rather than accident explains many collapses. 2. Method and standards for evidence. You use a comparative case method that links legal text to observable fiscal actions. You look for patterns that repeat across eras such as debasement, forced convertibility shifts, emergency decrees, and selective bailouts. You evaluate intent through incentives and contemporaneous statements, acknowledging that proof can be circumstantial yet legally persuasive when consistent and corroborated. Footnote. You rely on recurring legal monetary moves as probative signals of policy intent. 3. Roman statutory debasement. You study how the Roman state reduced silver content in coin while maintaining face value through legal tender rules. You see that this financed legions and bureaucracy without explicit taxation. You observe the transfer that followed as prices rose faster than wages and savings in good coin were drawn out of circulation, a wealth shift from dispersed citizens to the fiscal center. Footnote. You learn that lawful debasement acted as an inflation tax that centralized resources. 4. Yuan paper money and fiat overreach. You consider Kublai Khan's empire-wide paper currency that rested on decree rather than metal reserves. You track how fiscal pressure led to rapid issuance, loss of confidence, and hyperinflation. You connect policy scale to social breakdown as farmers and merchants exited markets when promises outpaced capacity to redeem. Footnote. You see how unconstrained issuance undercuts trust and triggers real economy retreat. 5. Weimar hyperinflation and debt politics. You analyze post-war reparations, fiscal deficits, and money creation in the Weimar Republic. You note that hyperinflation destroyed middle-class savings and domestic debt burdens while allowing well-placed actors to purchase productive assets at fire sale prices. You treat the episode as a caution about using currency decay to reorder claims. Footnote. You recognize that rapid price level collapse can function as a covert debt workout. 6. Closing the gold window in 1971. You examine how President Richard Nixon ended dollar-gold convertibility, enabling fiat flexibility for war finance and domestic programs. You track the subsequent inflation that diluted purchasing power for wage earners while easing real federal debt loads. You frame the shift as a lawful reset that redistributed risk from public balance sheets to private savers. Footnote. You observe that convertibility changes legally reassign losses to holders of money claims. 7. Asia in 1997 and external triggers. You review currency pegs, short-term foreign debt, and sudden stops in Thailand, Indonesia, and Korea. You assess how speculative attacks, forced devaluations, and conditional rescue programs moved ownership of local assets to external creditors. You read the crisis as an interaction between domestic fragility and global leverage-seeking strategies. Footnote. You conclude that external positioning can catalyze collapse when domestic defenses are thin. 8. The Playbook of Managed Collapse. You synthesize mechanisms that reappear across cases. You list debasement, monetization of deficits, legal revaluation, selective capital controls, and privatization in distress. You explain how these steps erase fixed claims, compress liabilities, and reset price signals in ways that favor insiders who planned liquidity and hedging in advance. Footnote. You identify a repeatable legal and financial sequence that reallocates wealth during disorder. 9. Distributional effects and winners. You track who tends to gain and who tends to lose. You find that leveraged sovereigns and connected creditors often exit with improved positions while wage earners and small savers absorb the loss through inflation and unemployment. You emphasize that the law of money is also the law of power because payment rules decide whose contracts survive. Footnote. You note that collapse is a selection device that preserves advantaged claims and voids weak ones. 10. Present risk signals. You evaluate current markers such as record public debt, balance sheet expansion by central banks, elevated inflation, and asset valuations disconnected from income. You ask whether policymakers will again trade monetary stability for short-term solvency. You advise reading emergency facilities, collateral policies, and disclosure gaps as early warnings. Footnote. You are urged to treat extraordinary balance sheet tools as forward indicators of redistribution. 11. Legal constraints and safeguards. You consider reforms that raise the cost of engineered collapse. You propose binding transparency on emergency issuance, sunrise and sunset terms for facilities, creditor class parity rules, and automatic restitution for inflation-induced expropriation beyond set thresholds. You also call for cross-border cooperation to curb predatory positioning during peg defense and devaluation windows. Footnote. You frame enforceable transparency and parity rules as the core of monetary due process. 12. Conclusion and action agenda. You end with a practical stance. You accept that money is a legal project managed by interests that can weaponize stability and disorder. You therefore demand institutional designs that align crisis tools with public purpose, document every transfer, and make ex post review real. You prepare to read every future collapse through the lens of who pays, who gains, and what the law enabled. Footnote. You commit to measuring any crisis by traceable transfers and the legality of the mechanisms used.